They always laughed at the quiet ones first. But inside Blackstone State Prison, the loudest man in the room was about to discover that silence could carry more weight than any threat. Breakfast usually sounded the same every morning inside Cell Block D. Trays sliding across metal rails, boots echoing against polished concrete, conversations rising and falling beneath fluorescent lights that never seemed to rest. Every inmate understood the unwritten rules long before sunrise. Keep your head down, finish your meal, avoid drawing attention from the men who believed fear was another form of currency. That morning, however, the rhythm changed the instant Elijah Brooks stepped into the cafeteria. At 72 years old, the quiet black inmate moved without hurry, carrying his tray with steady hands and the relaxed posture of someone who had long ago stopped allowing his surroundings to dictate his peace. His gray hair was neatly trimmed, his prison uniform perfectly clean despite the harsh conditions of daily life, and his calm expression never searched for approval from anyone around him. Several inmates glanced toward him before quickly looking away. They had watched the old man for weeks. He never argued. He never raised his voice. Every morning before dawn, while most prisoners still slept or stared at the ceiling counting another day behind bars, Elijah stood alone in the recreation yard, slowly moving through graceful motions that looked more like quiet meditation than exercise. Most people dismissed it as the strange routine of an old man trying to stay flexible. Nobody paid attention for very long. Ryan Carter certainly hadn't. At 34, Ryan had become the unofficial ruler of Cell Block D, not because anyone elected him, but because confidence spread through a prison faster than rumors. Tall, broad-shouldered, and endlessly convinced that every room belonged to him, he enjoyed turning ordinary mornings into public performances. Every laugh directed at someone else strengthened the image he had carefully built over the years. His friends gathered around the center tables as though they were front-row seats at a show they expected Ryan to headline. Once again, when his eyes settled on Elijah crossing the cafeteria, a grin slowly spread across his face. "Well, look who's practicing slow dancing before breakfast," Ryan called loudly enough for nearly every conversation to stop. A few nervous chuckles rippled through the room. Elijah continued walking without changing pace. His attention remained on the empty seat near the far wall where he always ate alone. Ryan stepped directly into his path before the older man could reach it. The laughter grew louder now, fueled less by humor than anticipation. Prison had taught everyone that moments like these rarely ended quietly. Ryan folded his arms and tilted his head. "I've been watching you every morning," he said with exaggerated curiosity. "Those little moves of yours. You think that's going to help you in here?" Elijah looked at him for a long moment. His eyes showed neither fear nor annoyance, only a patient stillness that somehow felt more unsettling than any angry stare. Around them, even several correctional officers paused to observe from a distance. They had seen Ryan create scenes before, but something about the old inmate's complete lack of reaction seemed to slow the atmosphere itself. Ryan mistook the silence for weakness. "Tell you what," he continued with a confident smile. "After breakfast, you show everyone what those fancy moves can do. One challenge, one move. That's all I'll give you." A few inmates exchanged uncertain glances. Others leaned forward, eager to witness another public embarrassment. Elijah lowered his eyes briefly to the tray in his hands before looking back at Ryan. His voice, when it finally came, was calm enough that several men had to strain just to hear it. "The strongest tree doesn't argue with the wind," he said quietly. For a heartbeat, nobody laughed. The words seemed too simple, too peaceful for a place built on constant tension. Then Ryan smiled even wider, convinced the old man had just handed him the perfect opportunity. What nobody inside that cafeteria realized was that the challenge had already begun, and the outcome would reshape everything they believed about strength. The cafeteria slowly returned to its usual noise, but it was no longer the same noise. Conversations that had filled the room only moments earlier became quieter, replaced by whispers that drifted from table to table like invisible currents. Every inmate had heard Elijah Brooks answer Ryan Carter with a sentence so calm that nobody could quite explain why it lingered in their minds. Ryan laughed loudly, making sure everyone nearby heard him, but the laughter around him carried a different tone now. Some joined in because they always did. Others forced smiles simply to avoid standing out. A handful remained completely silent, watching the old man continue toward his usual seat without changing the rhythm of his steps. Elijah placed his tray on the metal table beside the far wall and quietly thanked the kitchen worker who had handed him breakfast only minutes earlier. The worker, an older civilian named Harold, gave him a small nod before returning to his station. It was one of the few friendly exchanges Elijah ever had inside Blackstone State Prison. He unfolded a paper napkin with deliberate care, bowed his head for just a moment, and began eating as though nothing unusual had happened. That simple routine confused several inmates far more than any angry response ever could have. Ryan remained standing near the center of the cafeteria, expecting the attention to stay fixed on him, yet he noticed something unsettling. Eyes kept drifting back toward Elijah instead. It was not admiration. It was curiosity. The old man had refused to play the role everyone expected. Ryan disliked uncertainty almost as much as disrespect. He pulled out a chair and sat with his group, but his attention never completely left the quiet figure across the room. One of his closest followers leaned closer. "You really think he is going to show up?" the younger inmate asked. Ryan smirked. Everybody shows up when enough people are watching. The confidence in his voice sounded convincing, yet something inside him remained unsettled. Across the cafeteria, Elijah finished his coffee and looked through the narrow windows that overlooked the prison yard. Morning sunlight filtered across the chain-link fences, painting long shadows over the concrete walking paths. Every sunrise looked almost identical inside Blackstone, yet Elijah still paused to appreciate the changing light. It reminded him that time always moved forward, even when walls tried to convince people otherwise. Correctional Officer Daniel Mercer observed the cafeteria from the security station above. During 23 years working corrections, he had learned to recognize the difference between ordinary tension and something far more significant. This felt different. He watched Elijah on the monitor for another moment before quietly speaking to the officer beside him. "Keep an eye on the yard after breakfast," he said. "Something tells me today is not going to follow the schedule." His partner shrugged. "Because of Carter?" Mercer slowly shook his head. "No, because of the old man." When breakfast ended, inmates carried their trays toward the return window and formed orderly lines under the watchful eyes of correctional staff. Ryan deliberately slowed his pace until Elijah approached from behind. Without raising his voice, Ryan spoke just loudly enough for everyone nearby to hear. "Do not disappear after chow. I hate waiting." Elijah stopped for only a second. His expression remained completely relaxed. "Waiting teaches patience," he replied. "Some lessons arrive exactly when they should." Ryan rolled his eyes and walked away, convinced the old man enjoyed speaking in riddles because he had nothing else left. Yet several inmates standing nearby exchanged thoughtful glances. They had expected excuses. They had expected fear. Instead, they kept hearing calm answers that somehow refused to feed the conflict everyone anticipated. As the steel doors opened toward the recreation yard, small groups naturally formed along the sidewalks, but their conversations all circled back to the same question. Nobody debated whether Ryan would appear. They already knew he would. The mystery was Elijah. Why did a quiet 72-year-old man seem completely unbothered by the challenge that had already become the only story anyone inside Cell Block D wanted to talk about? The recreation yard at Blackstone State Prison had a way of revealing the invisible hierarchy that existed long before anyone spoke a single word. Painted boundary lines divided the cracked concrete into exercise zones, walking paths, and open gathering spaces, but the real divisions had nothing to do with paint. Every section belonged to someone. Every bench carried an unspoken history, and every routine reminded newcomers exactly where they stood. Ryan Carter had spent years making certain everyone understood those invisible borders. Wherever he walked, conversations shifted. Some inmates greeted him with forced confidence. Others quietly stepped aside. A few correctional officers watched him more closely than the rest, recognizing that influence often created more problems than open confrontation. Ryan welcomed every glance because attention had become part of his identity. He believed respect could only exist when people expected you to control every room you entered. Across the yard, Elijah Brooks quietly followed the same path he walked every morning. He stopped near a weathered oak tree that somehow survived inside the prison fence, its branches stretching above the exercise area like a silent witness to countless passing years. While other inmates lifted weights or circled the track, Elijah removed his prison cap, folded it neatly onto a nearby bench, and slowly inhaled the cool morning air. Then he began moving through another series of gentle Tai Chi motions with steady precision. His hands floated through the air without hurry. His feet shifted only inches across the pavement. Every movement appeared effortless, almost too simple to deserve a second glance. Yet something about the rhythm naturally drew attention. Even inmates who intended to ignore him found themselves watching for another moment before returning to their own conversations. A younger prisoner named Marcus Reed stood nearby holding a basketball beneath one arm. He had arrived at Blackstone only 4 months earlier and still struggled to understand the strange personalities inside cell block D. Curiosity finally overcame hesitation. "Sir," he asked quietly after waiting for Elijah to finish one sequence, "does that actually help?" Elijah smiled gently before answering, "Everything helps when you understand why you are doing it." Marcus looked confused. "I thought fighting was about being stronger." Elijah slowly shook his head. "Most people spend their lives trying to overpower the world. Very few ever learn how to understand it." Before Marcus could ask another question, a loud whistle echoed from the opposite side of the yard. Ryan had noticed the small gathering beginning to form around Elijah. It was nothing dramatic, only half a dozen inmates standing nearby, but Ryan disliked seeing attention move toward anyone else. He casually walked across the yard with several followers behind him, smiling as though the entire situation amused him. The crowd instinctively widened to make room. "Teaching classes now?" Ryan asked with a grin. "Maybe you should charge tuition." Several inmates laughed, although the sound lacked the confidence it carried earlier in the cafeteria. Elijah turned toward Ryan with the same calm expression he had worn all morning. "People learn when they are ready," he replied, "not when someone forces them." Ryan folded his arms. "Good. Then tomorrow morning you can teach everyone after our little demonstration today." The nearby inmates exchanged uncertain glances. Ryan continued speaking before anyone else could interrupt. "No excuses. No speeches. Everybody is already expecting it." Elijah remained silent for several seconds, looking not at Ryan but at the breeze moving through the leaves above them. Finally, he nodded once. "If that is what today requires, then I will be there." Ryan smiled with visible satisfaction, believing he had finally cornered the quiet old man into accepting the public challenge. He turned and walked away with renewed confidence, unaware that Correctional Officer Daniel Mercer had observed every second from the elevated security platform. Mercer narrowed his eyes thoughtfully. During decades inside prison walls, he had watched countless men pretend to be fearless. Elijah Brooks did not pretend. The old man carried himself with the quiet certainty of someone who no longer needed to prove anything, and somehow that unsettled Mercer far more than Ryan's loud confidence ever could. The promise spread through Blackstone faster than the morning count. By the time work assignments began, almost everyone inside Cell Block D had heard that Elijah Brooks had quietly accepted Ryan Carter's challenge without raising his voice or changing his expression. Nobody could remember another 72-year-old inmate agreeing to stand before the entire yard against the man who had built his reputation on confidence alone. Rumors multiplied with every passing hour. Some believed Elijah had simply grown tired of avoiding attention. Others guessed he had lost hope after spending too many years behind concrete walls. A few insisted the old man had no idea what he had agreed to. Yet those who had watched him closely over the past several weeks noticed something different. Elijah did not seem worried. He followed the same routine he had followed every day since arriving at Blackstone. He reported to the prison library for his assigned work detail, carefully returning worn books to their proper shelves while quietly helping other inmates find titles they could not locate. He treated every person with the same steady courtesy, whether they thanked him or ignored him completely. Librarian Susan Keller, one of the civilian employees who had worked inside the prison for nearly 15 years, often wondered why the older inmates seemed more patient than many people she met outside the facility. That afternoon, she watched Elijah repair the loose binding on an aging history book with remarkable precision. "You have done that before?" she said with a smile. Elijah nodded gently. "A long time ago, I learned that taking care of small things keeps bigger things from falling apart." Susan laughed softly. "You always answer questions in a way that makes people think." Elijah returned the book to the shelf. Thinking is usually quieter than arguing. Across the room, Marcus Reed had been organizing return magazines while listening to the conversation. The younger inmate walked over after Susan stepped away to answer a telephone call. "Mr. Brooks," Marcus said carefully, "are you really going through with it?" Elijah placed another book onto the shelf before answering. Sometimes avoiding a storm only allows it to grow larger. Marcus lowered his voice. "Everybody thinks he wants to embarrass you in front of the whole yard." Elijah smiled with surprising warmth. "Then perhaps everybody should spend less time predicting tomorrow and more time improving today." Marcus frowned, still unable to understand how anyone facing public humiliation could remain so composed. Before he could continue, the afternoon announcement echoed through the building, signaling the end of the work period. Inmates formed orderly lines outside the library, but conversations immediately returned to the same subject. Ryan Carter had made sure of that. Throughout the day, he visited nearly every recreation area inside the block, casually reminding people to be outside before evening movement. He spoke as though the outcome had already been decided. His confidence attracted larger audiences with every retelling, and by late afternoon, even inmates from neighboring housing units hoped they might catch a glimpse of whatever was about to happen. From the second-floor observation corridor, Officer Daniel Mercer quietly reviewed security camera footage from earlier that morning. He replayed Elijah's slow movements in the recreation yard several times, paying attention not to speed, but to balance. Something about the older man's posture seemed strangely familiar, although Mercer could not immediately place the memory. After another viewing, he leaned back in his chair and stared through the observation window toward the prison yard below. The evening sun stretched long shadows across the concrete, giving the entire yard an almost peaceful appearance despite the growing anticipation inside its fences. Mercer finally whispered to himself, "That is not the posture of someone walking into trouble. That is the posture of someone who has already made peace with whatever comes next." Without realizing it, he had spoken the one thought that nobody else inside Blackstone had even considered. As the afternoon slowly gave way to evening, the atmosphere inside Blackstone State Prison became unusually quiet. It was not the peaceful silence that sometimes settled over the yard after a long day. It was the silence of hundreds of people waiting for something they could not quite predict. Even inmates who usually avoided unnecessary attention found reasons to finish their work early, hoping to position themselves where they could see the open recreation area before evening movement ended. Ryan Carter welcomed every curious glance. The growing audience only strengthened his confidence. He walked through cell block D with an easy smile, exchanging jokes with his followers and speaking as though the outcome had already been decided. Every conversation ended the same way. "Do not miss it," he told anyone willing to listen. "You are about to see why nobody challenges me." His confidence spread quickly among the younger inmates, many of whom had never questioned his reputation. They believed experience always belonged to the loudest voice. They believed strength always looked impressive. They believed confidence alone could determine the ending of any story. Elijah Brooks spent the same hour doing something entirely different. After returning from the library, he carefully folded the blanket on his bunk, wiped the small metal desk beside his bed, and placed a worn paperback exactly where it had rested every evening since his arrival. His cellmate, an older mechanic named Leonard Hayes, watched him quietly for several minutes before finally speaking. "You know, the whole prison is talking about tonight." Elijah smiled faintly without stopping what he was doing. "People often speak the loudest when they know the least." Leonard leaned against the wall and sighed. "Most men would be nervous." Elijah picked up the paperback and gently brushed invisible dust from its cover. "Being nervous does not improve tomorrow." Leonard hesitated before asking the question that had been bothering him all day. "Have you ever done this before?" Elijah looked toward the narrow window where the fading sunlight painted soft orange lines across the concrete wall. "I have spent most of my life trying to avoid proving anything." That answer only deepened the mystery. Leonard wanted to ask more, but the evening announcement echoed through the housing unit, calling inmates to prepare for recreation. Around the same time, Officer Daniel Mercer walked into the security office carrying an old personnel binder that had not been opened in years. Something about Elijah's posture continued to bother him. He had seen it before, just not inside a prison. While another officer monitored the surveillance screens, Mercer slowly turned faded pages containing photographs from correctional training seminars held decades earlier. Most images showed instructors demonstrating defensive positioning and conflict de-escalation. Then he stopped. One photograph immediately caught his attention. The picture had faded with age, but the older instructor standing calmly before dozens of correctional officers looked remarkably familiar. The caption beneath the photograph simply read, "Guest Instructor Elijah Brooks, National Tai Chi Defensive Movement Seminar, Richmond, Virginia." Mercer stared at the page for several long seconds. The man in the photograph looked younger, yet the peaceful eyes had not changed at all. A slow realization settled over him. Elijah had not learned those graceful movements after arriving in prison. He had been teaching them long before many of the current officers ever wore a uniform. Mercer quietly closed the binder and looked toward the security monitor showing inmates entering the recreation yard. Across the screen, Ryan Carter laughed confidently while greeting another crowd of curious spectators. A different camera showed Elijah walking alone at his usual unhurried pace, hands relaxed at his sides, his attention briefly lifting toward the evening sky before returning to the path ahead. Two men approached the same destination carrying entirely different ideas about strength, and only one of them seemed completely untouched by the expectations surrounding him. The recreation yard slowly filled until it felt as though nearly every inmate in cell block D had found a reason to be there. Some leaned against the chain-link fence. Others occupied the weathered benches or stood in small circles pretending to discuss ordinary prison life, while keeping one eye fixed on the open concrete space near the center of the yard. Even those who normally avoided unnecessary gatherings sensed that something unusual was about to unfold. Correctional officers quietly adjusted their positions along the perimeter, not because anyone expected chaos, but because experience had taught them that large crowds often developed a life of their own. Officer Daniel Mercer stood beneath the observation platform with his hands folded behind his back, his expression far more thoughtful than concerned. He had not shared what he had discovered inside the old training binder with anyone else. Instead, he simply watched Elijah Brooks walk into the open area with the same measured pace he had maintained all day. The older man stopped several feet from the center of the yard and calmly looked around, acknowledging neither the whispers nor the curious stares surrounding him. Ryan Carter arrived moments later, greeted by confident smiles and encouraging remarks from his followers. He looked completely at home in front of an audience. To him, this gathering represented another opportunity to reinforce the reputation he had carefully built over the years. He stretched his shoulders dramatically, looked around the crowd, and smiled as though everyone had come to watch a performance that already had a predictable ending. "I appreciate all of you showing up," Ryan announced with an easy laugh. "This will not take very long." Several inmates chuckled, while others remained silent, their attention drifting toward Elijah instead. The older man simply stood with relaxed shoulders, breathing slowly as though he had all the time in the world. Ryan took a few casual steps closer. "You still have a chance to walk away," he said. "Nobody will blame you. They already know how this ends." Elijah looked at him with calm, steady eyes. The future has a habit of surprising people who believe they already own it. A few inmates exchanged uncertain glances. The answer was neither defensive nor challenging. It sounded more like quiet observation than argument. Ryan shook his head with an amused smile. "You really like speaking in puzzles." Elijah answered softly. "Sometimes simple truths sound mysterious to people who have never stopped long enough to hear them." The crowd grew even quieter. Marcus Reed stood near the back of the gathering, watching Elijah with growing fascination. Earlier that morning, he had believed the old man was simply kind. Now he began wondering whether kindness and confidence might not be opposites after all. Ryan slowly circled several steps to one side, carefully studying Elijah for the first time instead of dismissing him. The older man did not adjust his stance or track every movement. He simply remained balanced, relaxed, and completely present. That unexpected stillness created a strange feeling Ryan could not explain. For the first time all day, he found himself speaking a little less loudly than before. "Everybody keeps talking about those slow exercises," Ryan said. "Show us why anyone should care." Elijah gently lifted one hand, not toward Ryan, but toward the evening breeze drifting across the yard. "People often mistake slow for weak," he replied. yet rivers shape mountains without ever rushing. Nobody laughed. Even the inmates who usually echoed Ryan's jokes found themselves listening instead. The fading sunlight settled across the concrete, casting long shadows between the two men, while the entire recreation yard seemed to hold a single collective breath. Officer Mercer quietly glanced from Elijah to the crowd and realized something remarkable had already happened. Without raising his voice, without making a threat, and without taking a single aggressive step, the quiet old man had somehow become the center of every person's attention. Ryan had wanted an audience, but somehow the audience had stopped watching him alone. The evening air settled over the recreation yard with an almost impossible stillness. Hundreds of eyes remained fixed on the open space between Elijah Brooks and Ryan Carter. Even the usual sounds of distant conversations and clanking gates seemed to fade into the background, as though the prison itself had decided to watch. Ryan took another confident step forward and smiled for the benefit of everyone surrounding them. "You have been talking about patience all day," he said. "Now show everybody what it actually means." Elijah inclined his head slightly. "Patience is not something you show. It is something you carry." Ryan laughed again, although this time it sounded noticeably shorter than before. He slowly raised one hand, as if inviting Elijah to respond. "Then let us make this simple. One movement. That is all anybody wants to see." Elijah nodded once. "One movement is enough when it is the right one." The words floated through the quiet yard with surprising clarity. Officer Daniel Mercer noticed several experienced inmates exchange thoughtful looks. They were no longer smiling. Something about Elijah's voice carried complete certainty without sounding proud. Ryan interpreted that certainty as confidence that needed to be broken. He stepped forward with relaxed shoulders, intending to demonstrate his own balance before the watching crowd. Instead of rushing, he extended one arm toward Elijah with an exaggerated grin, inviting the older man to react first. Elijah did not move. His breathing remained slow. His feet stayed planted with effortless stability. The silence stretched for another heartbeat. Ryan shook his head. "Nothing?" he asked. Elijah answered softly. "You are already moving faster than your thoughts." A ripple of confused murmurs spread through the spectators. Ryan frowned for the first time all evening. He decided the performance had lasted long enough. Taking one measured step closer, he reached forward with the obvious intention of testing Elijah's balance in full view of the crowd. What happened next unfolded so naturally that many people later argued they had missed it entirely. Elijah neither resisted nor retreated. His front foot shifted only a few inches across the concrete. His shoulders turned with calm precision. One open hand lightly met Ryan's forearm, while the other gently guided the direction of his momentum. The movement resembled flowing water more than physical effort. There was no dramatic display, no burst of force, and no sign of struggle. Ryan's own forward motion simply carried him beyond the point where he expected to remain balanced. His feet searched for solid ground that was no longer beneath his center of gravity, and within a single quiet moment he found himself sitting on the concrete, more surprised than hurt, staring upward with complete disbelief. Nobody spoke. The yard fell into absolute silence. Ryan blinked several times as though trying to understand how something so small had produced such an unexpected result. Elijah had already returned both hands to his sides. His breathing had never changed. His expression remained peaceful. Marcus Reed looked from Ryan to Elijah and back again, unable to explain what he had witnessed. Several inmates whispered that they had expected some impressive display, yet they could not even describe exactly when the turning point had occurred. Officer Mercer felt a slow smile appear despite years of disciplined professionalism. He recognized the movement immediately now that he had seen it in person. It was not about overpowering another person. It was about timing, balance, and allowing unnecessary force to lose its own direction. Ryan slowly stood, brushing dust from his uniform with visible confusion. For the first time since anyone inside Blackstone could remember, he searched for words that refused to come. Elijah simply looked at him with quiet kindness and said, "The strongest victory is the one that leaves everyone able to walk away wiser." No cheers erupted. No celebration followed. The silence itself became the loudest moment anyone in Blackstone State Prison had experienced in years. For several long seconds, nobody inside the recreation yard moved. The silence that followed seemed almost impossible inside a maximum security prison where noise usually filled every empty space. Ryan Carter remained standing exactly where he had regained his balance, staring at Elijah Brooks with an expression that shifted from confidence to genuine confusion. He replayed the brief exchange again and again in his mind, searching for the moment when everything had changed, but no answer came. There had been no dramatic display, no burst of speed, no obvious trick. Somehow the quiet old man had redirected an entire confrontation with little more than calm timing and perfect balance. Around the yard, whispers slowly replaced silence. "Did you see that?" one inmate quietly asked. "I did, but I still cannot explain it," another answered. Marcus Reed continued staring at Elijah with growing admiration. Earlier that morning, he had believed strength meant standing taller than everyone else. Now he wondered whether true strength might begin with standing peacefully inside yourself. Officer Daniel Mercer finally stepped forward, his measured footsteps drawing the attention of nearby inmates. He looked at Elijah for a long moment before speaking. "I knew I had seen that posture before," he said. Several correctional officers turned toward Mercer with curious expressions. Ryan looked at him as well, hoping someone would finally explain what had happened. Mercer glanced toward the assembled crowd before continuing. "More than 20 years ago, while I was still in training, our academy invited a guest instructor from Virginia to teach defensive movement and conflict de-escalation. The instructors kept saying he could control a situation without trying to overpower anyone. Most of us thought it sounded impossible until we watched him demonstrate it." He paused and smiled faintly. That instructor was Elijah Brooks. The yard became quiet once again. Several officers looked at Elijah with renewed respect. A few older staff members slowly nodded as forgotten memories returned. One officer quietly whispered, "I remember hearing about those seminars." Mercer continued, "Correctional academies, police departments, community programs. He taught people how to protect themselves by understanding balance instead of chasing force." His classes were known across several states. Ryan looked back at Elijah, disbelief written across his face. "You taught officers?" he finally asked. Elijah answered with the same quiet humility he had shown all day. "I taught anyone who sincerely wished to learn." Ryan frowned. "Then why did you never tell anybody?" Elijah gently looked across the yard where dozens of inmates continued listening in complete silence. "Respect earned through stories disappears when the stories end. Respect earned through character remains even after every title has been forgotten." Nobody interrupted him. The words settled deeply. Among those who heard them, Marcus lowered his eyes, quietly repeating the sentence to himself so he would not forget it. Mercer folded his arms and added one final piece that surprised everyone even more. His seminars were never about winning. They were about making sure everyone could go home safely. That was always the lesson. Ryan slowly exhaled. The confidence he had carried all day seemed to dissolve into thoughtful reflection. For the first time since arriving at Blackstone, he realized he had spent years trying to prove his strength while standing before someone who had spent a lifetime teaching others that strength required no audience at all. Elijah picked up his neatly folded prison cap from the nearby bench and placed it back on his head. "Every person carries the opportunity to become better than yesterday," he said quietly. "The question is whether pride allows us to notice it." As evening sunlight faded beyond the prison walls, no one remembered the gathering because of a contest. They remembered it because a quiet man had revealed that the greatest influence rarely arrived with the loudest voice, and that single realization spread through Blackstone State Prison far faster than any rumor ever had. The evening count arrived with a silence that no officer could remember hearing before. As inmates returned to their housing units, conversations remained unusually calm. The story had already begun traveling beyond cell block D, carried from one corridor to another, growing not because anyone exaggerated what had happened, but because nobody could fully explain it. Some described the quiet movement they had witnessed. Others focused on the words Elijah Brooks had spoken. A few admitted they had expected an embarrassing spectacle only to leave thinking about balance, patience, and dignity instead. Ryan Carter walked back through the corridor without saying a single word. His followers stayed close, waiting for him to laugh the entire event away or offer another confident explanation, but none came. For the first time in years, Ryan was not thinking about how other people saw him. He was thinking about the questions he could no longer ignore. How had someone so calm carried so much confidence without demanding attention? Why had a man with so much experience never once mentioned it? Why had silence felt stronger than pride? Back inside his cell, Ryan sat on the edge of his bunk while the evening lights reflected softly against the concrete walls. He remembered every moment of the encounter and realized something unexpected. Elijah had never tried to embarrass him. Not once had the older man spoken with anger, celebrated afterward, or reminded anyone of what had happened. The realization weighed far more heavily than public humiliation ever could have. Across the housing unit, Elijah Brooks followed the same evening routine he had practiced every day. He placed his paperback on the small metal desk, folded his blanket with careful precision, and stood quietly beside the narrow window where only a thin strip of fading sky remained visible beyond the security fence. Leonard Hayes watched him for a long moment before smiling. "You know everyone is talking about you now." Elijah looked toward the last traces of sunset. "Tomorrow they will have something else to discuss." Leonard shook his head with quiet admiration. "Most people would enjoy the attention." Elijah smiled gently. "Attention is like an echo. It always fades. Character stays after the sound disappears." The next morning arrived just as every other morning had. Before sunrise, while most inmates remained asleep, one familiar figure stood beneath the old oak tree in the recreation yard. Elijah moved through slow Tai Chi forms as the first rays of light stretched across the concrete. To anyone watching from a distance, nothing had changed at all. Yet something inside Blackstone had changed forever. Several inmates who had previously laughed now paused to observe in respectful silence. Marcus Reed quietly joined the edge of the yard, copying the breathing rhythm as best he could without interrupting. Even Officer Daniel Mercer stopped for a brief moment during his morning patrol, offering a small nod before continuing his rounds. The greatest surprise came several minutes later when another familiar figure stepped into the yard. Ryan Carter approached. Slowly, without an audience and without the confidence that usually announced his arrival. He stopped several feet away and waited until Elijah completed the final movement. "I have been thinking about what you said," Ryan admitted. Elijah turned toward him with the same peaceful expression he had always worn. Ryan hesitated before continuing. "If someone wanted to learn where to begin, what would you tell him?" Elijah looked toward the sunrise beyond the fences before answering. "Begin by believing that becoming better is more important than appearing stronger." Ryan lowered his eyes and quietly nodded. Neither man spoke again. They simply stood together as morning lights spread across the prison yard, proving that the strongest victories are rarely measured by applause, but by the quiet decision to change after pride finally gives way to wisdom. And from that day forward, whenever new inmates arrived believing that strength belonged only to the loudest voice, someone inside Blackstone would simply point toward the old oak tree at sunrise and say, "Watch the quiet man. You will understand more than anyone can explain."